Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing A Streetcar Named Desire, written by Tennessee Williams. This play was first performed on Broadway back on December 3rd, 1947, and it has been adapted so many times, both on stage and on screen. I first read this play back when I was a junior in college when I took a playwriting course, and this is one of those plays where, even if you're not familiar with it, you're definitely familiar with the classic Stella, just that line, the screaming Stella. And then it's interesting because Stella, that line, is played up for comedy more often than not. One that comes to mind for me is the episode of Seinfeld, The Pen, when Elaine is kind of hopped up on painkillers, and she's just like, Stella, Stella. Another one that comes to mind for me is when Cam inadvertently is reenacting, because he's calling out for Stella, the dog, and he's like, oh my god, I'm wearing my white shirt, I'm just like a real-life Stanley Kowalski right now. But within the context of the play, it's really disheartening. And honestly, I rewatched this play now. There's a version of it on YouTube, a stage adaptation of it. And then I was kind of following along, reading it as well. And so I haven't read it since college, as I said. And truthfully, I forgot how absolutely depressing this play is and how you kind of end up feeling bad for all of the characters, especially, in my opinion, Blanche and Stella, the sisters. My god, I was like, oh god, this is really heavy. Like, why am I doing this to myself? Oof. But obviously it's such a well-written play. It's so rich with all of these thematic elements to it. I mean, I remember in my class us breaking down the title, the themes. I'm pretty sure we had to write a paper about it. So just kind of talking about the motifs and the character arcs and what each character represents. That's what's so wonderful about plays, honestly, how incredibly interesting they are and how there's so much beneath the surface of just the performances and the stage directions, like the dialogue and the stage directions. So it really is fascinating, and obviously it's an iconic play. And I was doing a little research then about Tennessee Williams in particular, and he wrote other plays, of course, including another one I read, The Glass Menagerie. He also wrote Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Sweet Bird of Youth, and The Night of the Iguana. And I didn't know, actually, that Tennessee Williams was in fact a gay man, and then as he got older, he then had an affair with a younger man, so he was kind of trying to recapture his youth the older he got. So art betrays life, art imitating life and vice versa. So for him, and seeing the parallels, honestly, with our protagonist, Blanche Dubois, because I remember, I just remember the conversations in class about our professor explaining, we're just, digging into the character of Blanche in particular and her real motives and, why she's doing what she's doing with certain characters at certain points in the play. So it really is interesting. And it's funny because those are things that I personally wouldn't have picked up on my own. But then once we discussed it as a class at the time, then it just seems so obvious. Then it's like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. That's what really is going on under the surface and everything. So Blanche Dubois comes to visit her sister Stella, and she stays with Stella and her husband Stanley Kowalski. And then we get to learn all of these secrets and the true reason for why Blanche is there. And she comes on a streetcar named Desire. So there's the literal streetcar named Desire, how she traveled there from Mississippi to New Orleans. And it mostly takes place in their flat, Stanley and Stella's flat where they live. And gosh, it's just, there's so much heartbreaking stuff in this play, obviously, with all of the tension and all of the anger issues, in particular with Stanley, and how he's honestly just such a monster and a horrible human being and so abusive. And he's a drunkard, and even Blanche says at the beginning that he's a commoner, like a common man, and then later on when she calls him an animal and brutish and all of these things, and of course he overhears it. But we see that Stella loves her sister, and Blanche adores Stella, but like it's as if she kind of takes pity on her. And then she sees, like, of course, obviously, with what happened with Stanley when at the poker game, and then he almost could have killed her. And we also find out that she's pregnant, carrying his child. And then, like, despite all of that, when he's like in his drunken state and when they all run out because they're terrified, and then he's screaming Stella over and over just in despair, and then she comes back and then they sleep together. And then the next morning when Blanche is saying, how could you have done that? Like, you can escape this. We can run off together. And so we're led to believe, first off, though, with Blanche, that the reason she's there, she's just taking a leave of absence from her job as a school teacher. And then, of course, we later find out what really happened. So I didn't really remember much. I only remembered certain key plot points of this play. So it was interesting revisiting it now. I forgot about Mitch, too, who is kind of a love interest, I guess, for Blanche. But really, it's just, I don't know, he's just kind of an escape for her. And he's the one, though, that she confesses the truth to, like, to whom she confesses the truth about her past in particular, which is that she married very young to a man named Alan Gray. She just does that whole long monologue where she just tells him everything. And then we later find out, like, when she says that she walked in on him with a much older man, and then he ended up taking his own life. And so then I remember this too, the scene with in the play, he's just called Young Man. The man who comes over when everyone else is gone, and he's collecting for the paper, and she's like, oh, young man, like, you're so attractive, and she's just kind of flirting with him and everything. And then she ends up saying, I'm going to just kiss you once, very gently and sweetly. And she kisses him, and then that's it. That's just that one scene, which is that one, he's never brought up again or anything either. And I remember my professor talking about that scene and him saying, in that scene, what she's doing is she's trying to kind of relive her youth in a way, because also that's part of her character with vanity, and how her sister even says, oh, just compliment her looks, when Stella says that to Stanley, and also with their neighbor Eunice, who is the first person Blanche talks to in the play, when she's saying, I'm looking for my sister, and I drove here on a streetcar named Desire, and all of that. That scene, though, with the young man, and then when she just kind of kisses him, and then that's it. In that scene, what she's doing is she's trying to actually be, since she's also in denial about her age, when in fact, like, she says, oh, she's my older sister, but not only by less than a year, but in fact, she is the older sister. She's in her 30s, and she feels she's losing her youth, and just kind of, like, in denial about that. And then also later with Mitch, when he just says, I've never seen you in the daylight, only at night. It's like, let me turn on the light and finally look at you. And then she's just, like, ashamed. She doesn't want to be seen for who she really is, that she's just getting older. And it's just like, who cares? But, it's part of her character struggle about holding on to her vanity and youth and sexual desire, about being desired. So with that scene, though, with the young man, going back to that, my professor explains that what she's doing is, in that scenario in her head, she is the older gentleman that, in her mind, seduced her husband. So she, in a way, is thinking of herself as a gay older man seducing a gay young man. And I thought, oh, wow, that's so interesting. I never would have picked up on that. I don't know if I would have picked up on that. It's just so interesting, though, to think of that in that moment. Also, with the theme of desire, how she said at one point when they bring up death, and she says, oh, that's the opposite of desire. Even talking about the title itself, that's just like you're on this path of desire and then eventually death. So, like, the older she gets, the less desirable she feels. That's why she's kind of in denial and just wanting to hold on to her looks and her youth and her beauty. And also I remember with this character in particular, too, when we talked about her, saying that she is a character who takes up a lot of space, both literally and figuratively. Literally in the sense that when she moves in, she has her big trunk, and then Stanley is rooting through it and seeing all of her luxurious garments and her tiara, and then Stella's saying, put that all back, and he's like, what's this, rhinestone? Like, what is this, like, diamonds and all of that? And she's like, oh, rhinestone, it's like, it's cheap, it's not anything great, because she talks about how she lost the family business or whatever it was. And so then, like, he thinks he's entitled to, since he's married to Stella, he says, what's mine is hers, so I'm entitled to half of those assets or whatever. So that's why he's looking for the papers and all of that. And then when he finds the, like, letters, and she's like, oh, these are love letters with Blanche, And so with all of them, in a way, it's like living in denial, particularly with Stella, that like she's just blinded, I guess, by the sexual passions. Then she stays with Stanley, like how she gets a thrill with it, she says, when she explains to Blanche too. It's like, oh, well, he took my slipper and broke all of the glasses on our wedding night, or whatever she says. And then she says, well, I'm happy. I desire this. This is what I want. And Blanche just can't believe that she wants to stay with this abusive man. And then him with like his poker night, that's when she first meets Mitch. Then she says, oh, well, he's like one that stands out from all the others. He's like a gentler, kind man. And even the thing with the inscription on his cigarette box, and when she says like, oh, well, there's a fine line between sorrow and like, that makes you a kinder person, like sorrow or whatever it is. Then when he talks about his mother too, it's like, well, my mother wants to see me settle down. And she says, oh, well, you'll be sad when she's passed, won't you? And that's when Blanche confesses all of that about her past with her husband, who ended up taking his own life. And so then with Stanley, he ends up finding out all this gossip about Blanche that ends up being true. That the reason she's run away to them now, and that the reason she's there in the first place, isn't because she's on leave of her job. It's because she's been fired, because she's been having affairs with younger men, with her students or whomever. And so then when she confesses to all of that as well. And so then, though, she's like getting further from reality when then she's just drinking more. And we see that thread throughout the play, too. And first she says, oh, well, 1 is my limit. And then she says, oh, well, just 2. But to be honest with you, I've had 3 tonight. Like when she talks to Mitch as well. So when she confesses all of that to Mitch, then that just kind of is the end of their relationship in particular. And then also with Stanley, when again he's like being a terrible human being and very violent and throwing things, and then poor Stella, she ends up going into labor with just all of this stress and everything. So then when she is at the hospital, and then he comes back, and we see Blanche just in her drunken state, and then we just find, like, we know the truth then about why she's there again and what really happened. And then when he ends up, like, the whole thing with them fighting and her threatening to kill him, I guess, with the bottle. And then when she ends up unconscious, and then we know that he assaults her. It's just so awful. And so then in that final scene, that this play, it's 10 scenes, I believe. So, and it's a really long play. It's long too, like even with the dialogue. But so yeah, to mention that again with Blanche, so she takes up space. I think I said this already, but she takes up space literally, like with all of her stuff, but also figuratively, as in with all of her lengthy dialogue. And she even says something to Stella, like, oh, you're always the quiet one, or whatever. So, like, she needs to just be, again, like, going back to her vanity, too, that she needs to be center, and she needs to be desired and loved and listened to. In that final scene when they're playing poker again, and then Stella had the baby, and that the baby's doing well, which is, thank goodness for that. And when the people come to take Blanche away, because they're gonna take her away to the hospital, and then she ends up saying, like, and then poor Stella is breaking down saying, what have I done to my sister? I forgot the end too, when she's crying out, Blanche, Blanche. That, for whatever reason, isn't as iconic as Stella. That's like the thing that stayed in pop culture, just that Stella line. And then again, in the context of the play, it's just like not, it's just weird how that's become a comedic thing, but then in the context of this play, it's so devastating. But at the end, when they take Blanche away, and she says, whoever you are, I have always depended on the kindness of strangers. And like even though Blanche told Stella what happened with her assault, that Stanley assaulted her, that Stella still chooses to stay with Stanley, and it ends with her crying and him comforting her. So it's, again, just like so devastating, but such richly written characters that you can kind of focus on each one and all these different things about each one. And it's just like, whew, what a heavy play. But it is a great play to revisit, I would say, definitely. But wow, it's just like so heartbreaking. Goodness. But again, it's just a critically acclaimed play of any play, honestly. Like, definitely like one of the best that people would agree, like one of the greatest plays to watch, or to read at least, So it's just like, oh, goodness. Just leaves you feeling like kind of depressed and just like, oh God, these poor people. Like, will they somehow get some semblance of grace and calmness and kindness even? So again, it's just so tragic, honestly. For me, I end up feeling so bad for Blanche and for Stella, but just hoping that somehow things will turn out better for Blanche at some point, even knowing like all of the bad things she's done too, having sex with minors, honestly, because of what had happened with losing her husband. And it's just really tragic, my goodness. But I mean, it is a good play, though, but my gosh, just revisiting it, I'm just like, oh, goodness, this was depressing, gosh. But it's just really interesting, though, to unpack, definitely, with all of the themes, as I said, and namely about one's desirability. And that's about it. That's all I gotta say. So with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. Be sure to visit storytellingsaga.com, follow on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and feel free to send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by emailing me at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I will be discussing Season 2 of Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.